YouTube? Tire Metalhead Weatherman here. Hopefully you guys are doing well. In this one, as promised in this morning's video, we're going to cover some severe weather and a little bit of the tropics here because I'm seeing an interesting trend on there. Before we do that here, hit that like button for me. Definitely smash that subscribe button and decimate that share button too. This information might be useful to quite a few people here. That being said, let's go ahead and jump into things here. We'll start out with the severe weather threat. Nothing noteworthy to talk about tonight, but there are slight risk for tomorrow and Saturday. For Friday in particular, I'm not necessarily impressed with the setup. I won't be going live for that at the moment. This obviously could change, but based off what I'm seeing here, I don't expect it to be a widespread event. I expect it to be very isolated. It also is indicated by the size of the slight risk area. Also, I want you to take note of the shape of the severe weather area from this dark green area to the yellow area all the way down. This is a pretty interesting shape here. I'll let your imaginations run wild here. Anyway, this is going to be mostly a wind-driven slight risk here, as this is the only 15% area that I see here. There is potential for hail, but it's only a marginal risk at best, and as of right now, it's a 0% tour risk. However, let's keep in mind here, that we've seen plenty of days where we've had multiple tornadoes in a 0 tour risk area. So let's not sleep on this. If you happen to be in an area with severe weather potential, or in Florida apparently, definitely keep an eye on the sky and be aware of changing conditions should storms form in your area. That being said, let's go ahead and take a look at Saturday. Saturday is where things get a little bit more interesting here, because we do have a much more broad slight risk area stretching even into the southeast here from Jackson, Mississippi, through Greenville, Mississippi, all the way even towards Oklahoma City, Wichita Falls, Fort Sill, and areas towards even central Texas and areas in between. That includes Dallas, Waco, Shreveport, Alexandria, and even Lufkin, Texas. I was about to say Waco twice. That being said here, that is our greatest area of concern right now. Not to say that anyone in this marginal risk area can't see some crazy weather too, but this is going to be the area that we're watching the closest, especially since we have a hatch risk area that exists now, which includes Wichita Falls, Dallas, and Waco at the moment, and the areas in between. Arlington, of course, is also in there, as well as Plano and other numerous cities. But with this one, it looks like all three hazards are possible here. And this is going to be a little bit more along the lines of the setup that we've been seeing throughout the course of May. We're going to start out with that kind of setup into early June. In fact, here is a sounding off of one of those setups here. We have actually pretty solid kinematics here, especially towards the mid-levels of the atmosphere. So this could have a pretty intense tour threat here. It's not the highest that I've seen with the significant tornado potential, but nonetheless here, the setup's pretty impressive right now. We'll have to see how this evolves throughout the day tomorrow, but this is towards mid-afternoon, late evening maybe. This is a setup that I'm more than likely willing to go live for. But let's go ahead and take a look at Friday's setup as well. I meant to have that up first, but I think I clicked the thing before I started the video. But as you can see here, shortwave is going to pretty much be the lifting mechanism for this setup here. Not a lot to really go off of in this region. Keep in mind, this is going to be our slight risk area right up in here. There's a very small shortwave right here. Depending on how this develops will determine whether we see severe weather or not. I think there's a chance, but it's a very small chance, and I think it's a very limited window with this setup. Nonetheless, though, not something to sleep on either, because if these storms do develop around this little shortwave, we could get some significance out of it. Once we go later into the evening and early into the morning, this setup kind of dwindles a little bit here. And then as we get into the afternoon on Saturday, we see a new shortwave develop, and this is where I got that sounding from, right across this region right here. This is over towards Dallas, by the way. Another interesting thing to note here is that within the different sections of that shortwave, we could have a lot of trouble here. So one thing to note is this has a pretty high significant tornado potential. The hordeograph is pretty interesting. This could be a little bit bogus, actually, if you ask me, based off of this. It's the first time I've seen this particular hordeograph, but one thing I want you to be paying the most attention to is this wind profile here. This is called a storm relative felicity. It's a little bit more complex as far as the weather world's concerned, but this is a pretty high number here. 480 meters squared per second squared. Usually with tornado threat, you're usually looking at about 100 meters squared per second squared. Once you get past 300, that's a pretty strong helicity. So that being said here, this looks interesting for sure. As far as everything else on this sounding is concerned, there are things that kind of lead me to believe there are some fail parameters here. But if I try to go into detail about that, I'm going to be here all night, and I barely have enough energy as it is right now. I actually just had an 11-hour work day today before coming home and doing this. So that being said here, real hot spots definitely seems to be existent around Dallas right now as far as the kinematic setup is concerned. So the tornado threat, I think, will be a little bit further on the southern end. More so towards the northern end here. I do think the potential would exist for maybe an increase in damaging wind potential. We may have to watch for severe weather on Sunday, but I can only go up to about 60 hours out on this model run. So probably tomorrow we're going to be, or Saturday morning, we'll be talking about a little bit further down the line. That being said, I am going to take a look at the low-level jet here, which is usually our tornado maker here. This is where our tornado juice tends to exist. Go ahead and move this forward. Like I said, Friday's setup, not the most impressive with low-level juice right here. Right around this region here, you're not going to see too much off these soundings. We did get one decent one, but one problem with this setup is that there is a pretty strong cap setup over this region here. If storms do manage to fire, though, there's plenty of downward cape, so the damaging wind potential is pretty high. It's going to be an interesting little storm setup here. This setup also would lend itself a little bit to hail, but as far as tornadoes are concerned, the kinematics are a little bit wacky right now, based off of what we're seeing on the NAM here, or the NAM 3 kilometer. So while I'm not willing to fully disregard this, I'm not super concerned about this setup as much. Definitely when we look towards Saturday, I'm a lot more interested in that. As far as the low-level jet is concerned, it's not as impressive as I would have thought it would have been. There are some pockets over here where we get up to about 20, 30, even 40 knots here. Sufficient enough for severe weather. And you do see a decent hordeograph here. You do see a decent just sounding in general. Pretty good setup for both hail and for tornadoes. Also really strong downward cape. So if storms were to fire in this region, all three hazards would be possible. Very unstable here as well, where we have mixed layer cape of about 2,900 and a surface cape of nearly 3,700. So pretty suitable environment for tornadoes, if I were to say so myself, based off what I'm seeing here. This is around 21Z, so this will be about maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon Central Time on Saturday. As time goes on, that low-level jet starts to move out, and then, of course, Sunday looks a little bit interesting around this region here. So, that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at the a little bit more of the thermo stuff. I'm going to mainly look at the moist sector, and that's going to be a key component to all of this. And I'm going to show you the stark difference between Friday and Saturday setup here. So when we look at Friday's setup, Not a very strong moisture return. It's a very limited area. Mainly going to be more so towards Kansas and the panhandles of Oklahoma and Texas here. Moisture, it's a question whether or not the moisture will even get there to aid in the development of storms here, because that's going to be a crucial factor. But when we look towards Saturday, however, the following day, much different story. We have an abundance of a moist sector here, and a very rich moist sector at that. We're sitting at 70-degree plus dew points early in the morning here, and these persist throughout the day here. So even across these regions further towards Oklahoma City and whatnot, where I haven't shown any soundings for tornadoes, threats for severe weather exist greatly because of that. This starts out as marginal severe, but this does pick up later into the evening. You do even see some small analog matches for hail here, even though there's just a marginal severe threat. Cap looks relatively weak over this region here. Storm relative felicity is weaker though. So there's a stark difference between Oklahoma and Texas right now, is the fact that the wind profile or kinematics are set up more so over Texas than they are at Oklahoma for this setup. Down the line, we could see a mess of things to come for both states. But that being said here, moist sector is pretty persistent, even lasting into the overnight hours, so we could see severe weather stretching further off to the east as we go into the evening. Maybe some of the parameters may fall off just a little bit, but for the most part, I'm thinking that we still will see at least damaging winds and hail. Tornado threat is still questionable at this point. But with the low-level jet pushing off to the east like it did, I'm not willing to say that there is a 0% chance. That being said, now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the instability here, or the convective available potential energy. It's usually put in combination with how, well, this starts out really with how an air parcel rises into the atmosphere and how steep it does so. Usually, I might have that mixed up with lapse rates. Disregard that. I'm a little tired, I'm sorry. But anyway here, Cape, when we look at Friday, there is sufficient instability here. Not the most impressive instability, but it's a very small window. It's earlier in the day across this region here. By the time we get later into the evening, which is when kinematics would start to kick in, look what's happened. A lot of our instability is gone. So I think the greatest threat will be a little earlier in the day, maybe even towards the morning hours for some of these guys here. But nonetheless, wow. Air temperature of 91 over towards eastern Colorado. That's crazy. But as you can see here, moist sector isn't super strong. You want to see more of those 60-degree dew points. We're just under that here. And this is a better example of Cape here. But again, my brain's kind of foggy right now. I feel like I'm about to get it mixed up with lapse rates, which is kind of silly of me. So I'm going to leave that alone for right now, and I'll probably talk about that in another video. But that being said here, we look towards Saturday, however. Look what happens here. And by the way, this is mixed layer Cape. Usually towards the surface is where you would see the higher amount of Cape. But me, I'm the type that wants to look at all levels of the atmosphere. I'm that kind of nerd. But anyway, when we look at the mixed layer Cape here, greatest concentration, interestingly enough, is over Texas. Also have to watch over towards the Texas-Oklahoma border here too. Because if you were to go off a sounding here, especially off of 22Z, pretty intense here. Still getting the TOR soundings, albeit not as impressive as hordeographs as what we were seeing over towards Dallas. But nonetheless, though, look at the surface Cape. Almost 6,500 joules per kilogram. Mixed layer is actually a little over 5,600. And a pretty strong lapse rate here, too, from the looks of it here, especially towards the surface. So a lot and I mean a lot going on here. So as a whole, things look I wouldn't say necessarily like a loaded gun setup, but this setup does look impressive and pretty menacing here. That being said, let's go ahead and get into the Tropics look. Yo, contentions. Alright, so before I get into this, I want to explain something. Before I got into this setup here with the ensembles, I'd been seeing a run on GFS where we had been seeing a major hurricane possibly developing in the Gulf here and heading towards the Gulf Coast here. One point towards Florida, one point towards Texas, and then Louisiana. At first, I wanted to disregard it because it was at the very end of the GFS run, or the GFS operational. Because one thing that I've said before, and I will say again many times on this channel, I'm sure, is the fact that the longer range you go out into a run, the less credibility it tends to have. So if you go all the way to the end of a 384-hour run, usually by the next run, things change. Usually in a pretty dramatic way. But I've been seeing a bunch of changes here with that run, but the potential of a major tropical system has kind of held on here. And then yesterday, even though I didn't mention it in a video, I did see some probability increase of something developing around this part of the Caribbean and making its way into the Gulf here. Keep in mind, again, this is towards the end of the model run here, but this is a great example of it right here. We're looking at the ensemble members here, and we see something develop here right around the 276th hour. And this is a little bit incoherent with some of the runs that I've been seeing previously. So I'm kind of side-eyeing this as to what could happen here. These red numbers are indicative of low pressure. The blue numbers are indicative of high pressure. And I'm seeing an increasing number of the red numbers here. And the values are also pretty high too. So I find that kind of interesting. So this isn't me saying, okay, this is going to happen. But this is definitely something to keep in the back of our minds here. Because it's interesting that this area over towards the Caribbean, which I would think would be a little bit unfavorable right now for a number of reasons, is showing potential for development based off ensemble models. I wouldn't be surprised to see this off the traditional GFS, or the operational model as it's called, or the Euro. But to see this on the ensemble definitely gets my attention a bit more. But that was the GFS or the GFS model, or its ensemble version that we just looked at. When we look at the Euro's ensemble version, interestingly enough, the same thing happens. As we go further and further along, you can see the same sort of imagery beginning to develop, even though we don't go out quite as far as we would with the GFS. It's about a 24-hour difference, but notice the slight increase in activity, and a few low pressure members popping up here, although not quite in the same kind of abundance or in the same kind of intensity. It's something to keep note of. Yesterday the trend was a little bit more towards GFS, but now we're kind of trending away from it again, which is a little bit reassuring, because obviously we don't want a major tropical system developing and heading into the Gulf, because usually by that point someone is going to be affected by it. But to see a little bit of correlation this far out, it does make you have to pay a little bit closer attention. So a couple of things we'll look at here from this point is going to be pretty much the wind shear from this point, because over towards the Gulf, we've talked about it before in one of my first hurricane outlooks, Gulf is still very warm, more than favorable enough to produce tropical systems and hurricanes. Wind shear is going to be the other main factor here. But when we look at wind shear, wind shear kind of shows us to start out around the time frame that we're in now is that we have pretty high wind shear across the Gulf here. But notice what happens as time moves on, especially as the pattern begins to change a little bit here. We do see a little bit of lightening up of wind shear around the Gulf, but then around the Caribbean, wind shear increases just slightly. But as we continue to go on here, look what happens. That wind shear starts to soften just a little bit over here, and there's a small pocket where maybe some storm development could be plausible at the very least. It's still a long shot in my opinion, but nonetheless here, to see this kind of trend, it does make you wonder, could there be some validity behind that? And the trend kind of holds up with the euro as well here, even though I have to go back real quick. Sorry about that. It's pretty concurrent, these two. We start out with a lot of wind shear around the Gulf and around the Caribbean, but it does start to lighten up a bit. And as time goes on, though, one key difference that I see with the euro is that there's still a little bit more wind shear over towards the Caribbean. But if we get into the Gulf here, it does lighten up here, right around this region. So again, a lot of variables coming into play as to whether or not we would actually see some sort of development. I still lean towards no, but it's just an interesting trend that I thought I would show you here and something to keep an eye on. I always try to see if I can do what I can to tell you guys about anything first when it comes to any sort of weather. Doesn't always work, but I at least try. But I want to try to be a dependable source for you all of you that have been watching towards the beginning or just watching today. That being said, here it's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you know what to do. Again, hit that like button, smash that subscribe button, and face kick the share button. Also, if you have any questions in the comments, feel free to ask away, and I'll do my best to answer as many of those as I can. But anyways, this has been Tire Metalhead Weatherman. I'm gonna call it a night here and go to bed. Until then, you guys take care and have a good night.